ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Brothers and sisters, throughout our day-to-day existence, on every single day that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us, returns our souls to us from our sleeping at night and allows us to wake up the next day. Every single human being will sacrifice for something during that day. That every single day that we are alive, every day that we get up out of our beds, we make a sacrifice. And the extent of our sacrifice is determined by what we value and hold important. Not just for that particular day, but in the larger scheme of our lives. That if a person has no value that they place on their energy and their physical ability to do anything in this world, they will just sleep their days away. Their sacrifice will be that I will not do anything this day other than sleep. I will sacrifice any productive activity because I put more value on sleep than I place on getting out of my bed and engaging the society. And so for the purpose of the khutbah today, I want to talk just a little bit about sacrifice and how we can look at our personal sacrifice and see within how much time and energy we put into a thing, whether this is a job, whether it is school, whether it is a relationship, regardless of what it is, we will only get out of it what we put into it. Brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator, knowing our natures, didn't just leave us alone and try to have us figure out what is important for us to sacrifice for on a day-to-day basis. If this were the case, we'll spend most of our lives grasping at straws, trying to figure out what should I be spending my time, my energy, my money on. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it very simple and clear for us. He reminds us of the purpose for which we were created and then gives us and assigns us roles that would demand a sacrifice from us on a day-to-day basis. Brothers and sisters, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in clarifying who we are as human beings and how we should spend our times as human beings, what should we struggle and sacrifice for? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it easy for us. The sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam gives us a very clear and practical guide what we need to sacrifice for. How should we spend our time, our energies, and monies on a day-to-day basis? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Qul, or say, Inna salati wa nasuki wa mahyahya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alameen, that truly my prayer and my service of sacrifice, my life and my death are all for the Rabbil Alameen, the Lord of all of the worlds. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it clear that every sacrifice that we make, whether it's going outside of our homes to work and to provide for our families, this is still feasibilillah. It doesn't fall into some category, well, this is dunya and this is ibadah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so merciful to us that if you and I are motivated by the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then everything we do becomes an act of worship for our Creator. In the interest of time, let me just share a couple of, one or two examples that we can look at from the pages of the history of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we can look to this best generation of believers and try to determine how did they, based on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them, what did they do with what they had, that not what somebody else, and measuring their sacrifice to someone else, but what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them. You and I know that there are certain figures from the seerah, the history of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that jump out on us, at us. They stand head and shoulders above the rest. And we look at these examples and we are inspired by these examples. We know the sacrifices of Abu Bakr, of Umar, of Ali, of Uthman, of Abu Darda, of Mu'adh. We know their sacrifices. I want to just mention the sacrifices of maybe a couple of these brothers and sisters that we may not be as familiar with. Brothers and sisters, when we take just for a moment to look into the history of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we find one of these Sahaba who was not someone in the early days of the revelation of Islam that was even in the physical company of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That we have at one of these Sahaba who was not an Arab, he was not from Bani Hashim, he was not of the Quraysh, but the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say about him, because of his sacrifice for this deen, that he is of my family. Everybody at a point in the history during the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to claim Salman al-Farsi. They wanted to claim this brother from Persia because of his sacrifice, because of the spirit that he had. Everybody wanted to say, he's of our clan. No, he's from my tribe. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no, Salman is of my family. Let's end this. He's of the best family. He's from my family. When we take a minute to look at his story, even how he was able to arrive at submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he gave up a very comfortable life. You know his story better than I. You know that his father loved him so much, he didn't even want him to go outside the house. He wanted to protect him. He wanted to educate him. He didn't want anything harmful to happen to him. And then one day, his father told him to attend to the business affairs. I'm so busy as the leader of this village that you have to go tend to the business. While he was on his way, you know the story, how he heard some Christians worshiping. And this started a process where he ended escaping from his father when he told his father, I like what these Christians are saying, and escaped to Syria so that he could worship his Lord in the way that he thought was best for him to worship. That he left behind everything that he had, the luxuries that he had and all these things. He ended up getting sold into slavery. He was bought by this Jewish man, and then he was a nice guy, and then he was sold, I think, to his nephew. His nephew was not as nice. He overheard from, as he was pruning dates in a tree, he overheard what a Christian in Syria had told him about a prophet who was going to come. and that this prophet would be known from various signs. He would be very honest, and that this particular prophet would be someone that if you gave him sadaqah, he wouldn't touch it. But if you said this is a gift, then he would indulge. So in the interest of time, we find that Salman was able to embrace Islam at the hands of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ at tremendous sacrifice, and his life as a Muslim was one of sacrifice, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made it clear that everything that we do, every sacrifice we make, our life and our death should be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let me just share the story quickly about another of these Sahaba that we may not be quite as familiar with. But we all should know his name and his story because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala references him in the Qur'an. Abdullah ibn Maktoum. Maktoum was born into this world blind, that he was born without any sight whatsoever. But there was nothing wrong with Ibn Maktoum's ears and nothing wrong with his heart. So while living in Mecca, almost as soon as he heard the message that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was extending to the people of Mecca, Abdullah ibn Maktoum was one of the first to embrace Islam. Here's a blind man with no wealth, with nothing of worldly value, that people would look at this man and say that this is a wonderful person. So Ibn Maktoum, as we know the story, that as one day when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was busy in his da'wah, talking to the leaders of Mecca, like Umayyah ibn Walid, the father of Khalid ibn Walid, talking to people like Abu Jahl, talking to Shayba and other people who were the leaders of Mecca, Ibn Maktoum, because of his love for the Qur'an, came to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and remember, he's blind. So he doesn't see who the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was talking to. Maybe it wouldn't have made any difference if he had seen him. But he went up to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ while the Prophet ﷺ was so busy trying to give da'wah to these tribal chieftains, thinking that if they embraced Islam, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will strengthen this young ummah, this developing ummah in Mecca. And so the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Qur'an, turned away from Ibn Maktoum. He frowned at him and started to pull away, without saying that his body, a language would say, can't you see who I'm talking to? I'm talking to these important people. And here you come, just wait, just be patient. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't wait. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed a surah chastising the Prophet Muhammad, Surah Abasa, the 80th surah in the Qur'an, chastising the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That what makes you think that these chiefs that you are so just fervent about, you think that they may believe, forget about them. What about this person whose heart is just crying for this deen, and you're turning away from him, and you are trying to spend so much time with these rich leaders of Mecca? Read the surah, Surah 80.